Okay, well, I guess that's a sign that it's about time for us to start. So welcome, everyone. My name is Coby Klein. I'm a biologist. I teach at SUNY Old Westbury and Baruch College. And I said, I check out science news all the time, looking for interesting stories to share with my students. And there's a lot of bad news in the world, a lot of bad news about nature, especially. And, there have been 5 mass extinction events in this planet's history. And it's been said that we are entering a 6th mass extinction. And we're currently losing species at a much higher rate than at any time in the last 1,000 years, maybe even since the end of the last ice age. But in the midst of all these dark clouds, there are some silver linings. There are some species that have been threatened with extinction, that have been pulled back from the brink, and we're going to learn about a handful of those today. So our agenda for this afternoon, we're going to talk about a few species where we're going to limit ourselves because there are a lot of different stories out there we could tell, but we're gonna stick to 10, and we're gonna talk about why these animals became endangered in the first place and how they were saved. And because there are so many candidates to choose from, we're gonna limit ourselves to 10 different North American species. And the first one is a fish that is very, very tiny, a very small, unassuming fish called the Snail Darter. It's not a particularly well-known species, but nevertheless, this tiny fish has had an outsized effect on the way that endangered species are managed in this country. The Snail Darter is a small freshwater fish that's endemic to just a few rivers and streams in eastern Tennessee, and maybe just the northernmost parts of Alabama as well. This species was only first discovered in 1973, so it's only been 50 years that anybody knew that this fish existed. And 2 years later, it was placed on the endangered species list. 2 main features of this fish led to its scarcity. One is the set of environmental conditions to which it is adapted. This species requires gravel shoals that are free of silt and aquatic plants, with moderate to strong currents and moderate depths. The substrate they prefer generally must consist of dark micaceous sand with little or no silt, and about 25 to 50% of the area scattered with gravel. Now, that is a very, very specific set of habitat requirements, and in their range, those conditions can only be found in the lower reaches of some of the tributaries of the Tennessee River. Now, being such a habitat specialist means that this species population was never very large and probably never will be. It also means that any change to the quality of their habitat could be disastrous for them. Now, the other reason the species has become endangered is because of a dam, in particular the Tellico Dam, which was scheduled to be constructed in and around the year 1973 on the Little Tennessee River. The dam project had been authorized and begun actually before the passage of protective environmental legislation. But on August 12th, 1973, David Etnier from the University of Tennessee discovered this fish in the Little Tennessee River while doing research related to a lawsuit under the National Environmental Policy Act. And the lawsuits said that the Tellico Reservoir would alter the habitat of the river to the point of killing off the fish and causing them to go extinct. And these lawsuits slowed down the construction of the dam, but they didn't stop it. And after the Supreme Court upheld the protections under the National Environmental Policy Act, Congress passed legislation specifically exempting the Snail Darter from protection. So the dam project and the inundation of the reservoir was completed eventually in 1973. In 1978, though, before the dam was completed, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency launched a recovery plan to preserve the snail darter by transferring this species to other river systems. And its native range was originally in the lower parts of the Little Tennessee River, the Sequatchie River, and Chickamauga Creek, but was later eliminated from the Little Tennessee by the completion of the Tellico Dam. But the species was transplanted to the Hiwassee River in southeastern Tennessee. And now this species continues to survive in these new rivers. So the Tellico Dam was finished, the reservoir was completed, swamped out the snail darter habitat, but they're still around thanks to the actions of the EPA and state regulatory agencies. Our next species that faced extinction is the American alligator. And we generally don't think of alligators as being particularly rare or scarce nowadays. But back in the 1970s and even earlier than that, they definitely were. Now, the alligator is a keystone species in the southeastern US, and that means that if they were to disappear, the freshwater wetland ecosystems where they live would collapse. Their prey species would proliferate, and those prey species would end up eating plants and animals that would face extinction themselves. And that's almost what happened not that long ago. As far back as the 19th century, gators were hunted for both meat and their skin to make leather. And by the mid-20th century, gator populations had almost completely disappeared in the US. It was a very serious situation, serious enough that the species was given federal protection in 1967, even before the passage of the Endangered Species Act. That helped a little bit, but illegal poaching continued well into the 1970s, and populations dwindled even further. It took only about 20 years to get alligators back on track, though. Their recovery was facilitated by private farms that were regulated by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, along with state game agencies, captive conservation breeding programs, and other means of commercialization. So basically what that means is alligators were farmed for food and other products like their leather, handbags, jerky, shoes. But by regulating these practices legally, combined with captive breeding programs, their populations increased very drastically. And while morally controversial to some people, the success of that program is undeniable. 20% of the captive populations were released back into the wild, and the others were used for meat and commercial products. This was a way to virtually kill the black market demand for alligator meat and skins. That helped the species recover, regulated animal safety, and also provided legitimate farmers a way to make a living. And gators ended up being delisted in 1987, and there are now over 1 million of them living in the wild. And I just got to see one for the first time this past winter in Florida. My very first alligator, a really big one too. So our next species of interest is the stellar sea lion. And stellar sea lions are found on both sides of the Pacific Ocean, both on the Asian side and the American side. They're found in the North Pacific from Japan up to Russia, across the Bering Sea to Alaska, and down the American coast to Northern California. They are slightly bigger than the more familiar California sea lion. They eat fish and squid and octopus. They are considered to be two subpopulations, the eastern stock and the western stock. And the dividing line between those completely separate populations is right here in Alaska. These two subpopulations, the eastern and western stock, are genetically distinct and morphologically distinct as well. By that we mean that they are physiologically, they're different. They have different body size and so on. Studies show that they don't really mix at all. The eastern and western stocks They don't interbreed with one another. And the populations of both subgroups fell off a cliff, or maybe fell off a fjord if you're into, Arctic puns. And their populations dropped in the 70s and 80s. They were listed as endangered finally in 1990, and really nobody knows why they declined in the first place. There are several hypotheses about the causes, and the truth is that it's probably a combination of all of them. One problem was fishing practices that accidentally trapped and killed sea lions along with fish. Another possibility is overfishing of their favorite prey, which meant that they had to switch to leaner, less nutritious fish. Short-term climate change probably also played a role. When oceans warmed up, as happens from time to time due to the El Nino cycles, phytoplankton decline, which leads to a decline in the fish that eat the plankton and the fish that the sea lions depend on. There are longer-term cycles at play also. Archaeological research, for instance, shows that sea lion populations naturally go through boom and bust periods. Regardless of the cause of the population decline, the eastern stock has recovered to a sufficient degree that they were delisted in 2013. The western stock is still recovering. Populations are inching upward, but not as quickly as the eastern stock. And there's still the looming threat of climate change, which poses problems to their food supply, and sea level rise, which can threaten their rookeries, right? They have their babies on beaches, and if the sea levels rise, beaches are going to get swamped out, and they're going to lose a place to safely give birth. But for now, anyway, the danger seems to have passed. And our next creature is another marine animal, and that's the humpback whale. Humpback whales were hunted as early as the 16th century. They were often the first species to be harvested in an area due to their coastal distribution. North Pacific kills alone are estimated at 28,000 even during the 20th century, after several hundred years of commercial whaling. In the same period, over 200,000 humpbacks were taken in the southern hemisphere. North Atlantic populations dropped to as low as 700 individuals. In 1946, the International Whaling Commission was founded to oversee the industry. They imposed hunting regulations and created seasons in which commercial hunting could be conducted. To prevent extinction, the IWC banned commercial humpback whaling altogether in 1966. And by then, the global population had been reduced to around 5,000 individuals. All right, so that's a severe decline. That's, what is that, like a quarter of their previous, actually less than a quarter. It's like a quarter of 10% of their previous populations. If the previous numbers are to be believed. Currently, oops, went the wrong way. Hold on just a sec. There we go. Currently, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature lists the humpback whale as a species of least concern, with a population worldwide of around 135,000 individuals, of which 84,000 are mature and can reproduce. And their population is on an upward trend. Prior to 2008, they were listed as vulnerable by the IUCN. Regional estimates right now say that there are around 13,000 whales in the North Atlantic, 21,000 in the North Pacific, and 80,000 in the Southern Hemisphere. For the isolated population in the Arabian Sea, there are only around 80 individuals, and this population is considered to be endangered. But in most areas, humpback whale populations have recovered from historic whaling, particularly in the North Pacific. This recovery has led to the downlisting of the species threatened status in the US, Canada, and Australia. And in Costa Rica, the Baena Marine National Park was established for humpback protection. Whales are now quite regularly seen off of Long Island. There are whale watching boat trips that sail from Brooklyn and go around New York Harbor. There are also trips that leave from Freeport and Montauk. I've seen I've gone on one of those Montauk whale watching trips. We saw a lot of whales, just not humpbacks that day. We saw fin whales and dolphins and stuff. Really, really awesome trip. You can also see whales from on shore if you're a landlubber. You can see them pretty frequently in Rockaway Bay during the summer, off Jones Beach and Fire Island, pretty much all times of the year. You just have to get lucky. I have seen them. I have seen them off Fire Island a couple of different times, and it's always a thrill. You need a good pair of binoculars at the very least. But if you are looking in the right place at the right time, you'll see them spout. You'll see them march out of the water. You might even see them breach if you get really lucky. Moving on, our next formerly endangered species is the American bison. And the historical range of the American bison by 9000 BCE was described as the Great Bison Belt, which was a tract of grassland that ran from Alaska all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, as well as east to the Atlantic seaboard, as far north as New York, as far south as Georgia, and according to some sources, further south, even to North Carolina and Florida. It's no great mystery why bison disappeared from North America. It's estimated that there were once 60 million bison roaming the continent, and by the late 19th century, all but around 100 of them had been shot dead. Of those, only about 25 remained in the wild in Yellowstone Park. Most of the rest were split between small herds on private lands. New York actually played an important role in reestablishing bison out west. William Hornaday was a hunter turned conservationist who became director of the Bronx Zoo in 1896. He had already begun to advocate for bison conservation before then, and when he became director of the zoo, he acquired a population of bison and began a captive breeding program. He also formed the American Bison Society, which began to reintroduce Bronx-bred bison back into the Great Plains. Good Lord, try to say that 5 times fast. He started with a herd that were sent to what is now the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. To this day, Bronx Zoo bison are being distributed across the plains to bolster populations and genetic diversity of wild herds. From about 25 individuals, there are now about 6,000 bison in Yellowstone, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 individuals in the wild, all over the U.S. Most of them, though, live in fenced-in areas, mostly in national parks. These bison actually were photographed in Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge in Colorado near Denver. They have a small herd there. I visited there a few years ago. I didn't realize they had bison. When I was driving into the park, I saw this big brown lump off on the prairie, way off in the distance, and I thought, kind of that lump looks like a bison, but I'm sure it's just a rock or something. And then I got closer. No, it was bison. They've got, like I said, a small herd there. They're completely fenced in, but it's just really cool to see bison on the prairie, whether they got there on their own or not. So from a low of 100 individuals, there are now 500,000 potentially in the world. And that even if most of them live in captivity, or at the very least live in captive-like conditions, it's still really something considering how few there were a century ago. And bison are really, really important species for maintaining the diversity of grassland habitats. Their presence is connected with the growth of numerous prairie plant species and the absence of trees from that particular landscape. Speaking of the prairies and Yellowstone Park, our next species is found out west, and that is the gray wolf. And actually, this is where things get a little bit complicated. We'll try to explain things as best we can. Here's what I can tell you about wolves with certainty. They once occupied pretty much the entire continent from north to south and from east to west. Then we started killing them, mostly over perceived conflicts with farm animals. The wolves of North America were quickly driven out of the eastern US, except for the northern parts of Ontario and southwestern Quebec. Others remained in the upper Midwest, specifically in Michigan and Ontario. Michigan and Minnesota, I should say, as well as Western Ontario. Wolves out west were hunted nearly to extinction as well, again, thanks to conflicts with ranchers. There were once 2 million wolves in North America, and it's not exactly clear how many were left in the 20th century, but it's clear that there weren't very many. But this is the complicated part. When it comes to wolf conservation, we aren't exactly sure how many wolves there are. And I'm not talking about how many individual wolves, I'm talking about wolf species. The gray wolf evidently migrated across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, and from there it diverged into different geographic subgroups, which today we recognize as different subspecies, or maybe even different species, period. Or maybe not. Coyotes are recognized by everyone as a distinct species, except coyotes and wolves have evidently been hybridizing for a long time. In fact, it's thought that all eastern coyotes are hybrids, not just of western coyotes and gray wolves, but also with domesticated dogs and eastern wolves. And we'll get to those in a little bit. Red wolves from the southeastern United States are highly endangered as well. And the fact that they aren't extinct yet is a conservation success story by itself, but they're still nowhere near recovered, and they may never be. Red wolves themselves are a sister species to coyotes, but it hasn't always been clear if they were a separate species or not. They're very similar to coyotes, and it was thought for a while that they were the product of a wolf-coyote hybridization a long time ago, but genetic testing seems to have ruled that out. And red wolves should be considered their own separate species, but they, in more modern times, have hybridized with coyotes a lot, as the coyotes have spread into the eastern US and red wolves disappeared. And then there's the timber wolf, also known as the eastern wolf. Most consider it a subspecies of gray wolf from the eastern half of the continent. The only populations remaining are in Ontario and Quebec, as well as Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. It seems like nobody can really agree on what to call the timber wolf. Is it, in fact, a gray wolf subgroup, or is it a gray wolf coyote hybrid, or a gray wolf red wolf hybrid, or the same species as the red wolf, or its own separate species? Like I said, it's really complicated, and there's really no definitive agreement on how we should consider these wolves. And all this stuff matters because for conservation purposes, you have to know, especially if you're doing captive breeding or if you're translocating captive bred animals and releasing them back into the wild. There were people arguing against listing of red wolves because they argued that they weren't a full species and therefore weren't deserving of protection. And instead, they were a wolf-coyote hybrid and therefore didn't count. Like legally, they couldn't be listed as endangered species by the government because they are not a species. So thankfully, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife listed them anyway, and we'll set that aside for the moment and discuss the recovery of wolves out west. Wolves today occupy only a small fraction of their previous range. But after they received federal protection, gray wolves saw tremendous recoveries in the western Great Lakes region. Their population grew and spread through Wisconsin and Michigan. And through natural migration, natural migration from Canada and reintroduction to Yellowstone National Park and central Idaho, wolves returned to the northern Rockies and have established a foothold in the West Coast states. Recovering populations exist in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Washington, and Oregon, and a few wolves have even begun to move into California. Mexican gray wolves in the southeastern US have begun to recover as well. Between 1977 and 1980, the last few surviving Mexican wolves were captured and bred, and some of their progeny were reintroduced into Arizona and New Mexico. Although this subspecies continues to struggle in the US and Mexico, at least it has a hope of recovering in the wild. But the most celebrated population of reintroduced wolves, of course, is from Yellowstone National Park. They were completely extirpated from the park by the 1930s, and they remained gone until the early 90s. Those reintroduced wolves were heralded as having saved the Yellowstone ecosystem by hunting elk, which allowed trees to regrow along riverbanks, which stopped erosion, which allowed beavers to come in and build dams, which created habitat for fish and frogs and turtles and birds. But here's the thing. They may not have done any of that. There are some researchers out there who actually say that the damage done to Yellowstone during the absence of wolves is irreversible, and the extent to which anything has changed, it can't be attributed to wolves, which don't eat that many elk. It was more likely grizzly bears, or maybe nothing at all, because elk populations haven't really changed that much. Oh man, everything with wolves is so complicated. But there are actually researchers who do say that, yes, trees are regrowing along the riverbanks. And yes, elk populations are down. And I think the compromise position here is that Yellowstone is enormous, and each group of researchers was maybe looking at a different section of the park. And the effects of wolves on elk populations and trees might be different in those different areas. And what of the eastern wolf? They're protected in Canada and the upper Great Lakes. And 2 years ago, a hunter shot what he thought was a coyote in Cherry Valley, New York, which is just west of Albany. But it turns out it wasn't a coyote, it was a wolf. It appears to have been a young dispersing male off to seek his own fortune away from his home pack. Probably wandered down from Canada, but who knows, maybe from Michigan too. It's not entirely clear. The state DEC has been kind of cryptic about whether or not wolves currently breed in New York State. And the fact that they're not saying definitively no means that actually there might be some wolves breeding in the Adirondacks. And in fact, some people have gone so far as to suggest that wolves should be reintroduced into the Adirondacks to control deer populations in the state, which is kind of ridiculous, because how would wolves in the Adirondacks help control deer anywhere else in the state? Nevertheless, it would be hard to imagine even considering wolves living in New York not that long ago, but it's a realistic possibility now. All right, so that covers the mammal portion of today's talk. And let's move on to a small bird called the Kirtland's Warbler. And the story of Kirtland's Warbler is one of habitat loss. These tiny birds occupy a small range in the same general region as timber wolves, so Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ontario. There, they nest in large stands of young, dense jack pine trees. The loss of this habitat was mainly due to fires, or actually rather the lack thereof. As I mentioned a moment ago, Kirtland's warblers only nest in dense stands of jack pine, but as the trees age, they compete against each other, and some trees end up falling down. And as the forests thin out, that opens gaps in the canopy, which is great for understory plants, but not great for the warblers that live in the jack pine trees. Periodic fires help clear out old growth and encourage new trees to start growing. And furthermore, jack pines, like pitch pines that grow in the Long Island pine barrens, produce what are called serotinous cones, which means they only open and release their seeds. They only germinate when they're exposed to the extreme heat of a wildfire. Kirtland's warblers have always been rare, only having been discovered in 1841 and described as a new species in 1861. But decades of fire suppression and clearing of land for agricultural use left the warbler in perilous straits. By 1974, there were fewer than 200 pairs left in the wild, and their habitat was reduced to less than 7 square miles in the mid-90s. A further complication is that this species, for some reason, is unusually susceptible to parasitism by cowbirds, meaning cowbirds like to lay their eggs in Kirtland warblers' nests. And that means that the Kirtland warbler eggs or chicks get discarded. So the Kirtland's warbler was listed as endangered in 1967, and a recovery plan was developed shortly thereafter. The plan called for management by state and federal agencies through clear cutting, controlled burning, and planting of jack pines to expand their nesting habitat, as well as having the government acquire more land for this purpose. The other components were to limit public access to land during nesting season and conduct annual censuses of warbler populations, and also to intensively control the cowbird population to make sure they weren't taking too many or parasitizing too many nests. Prescribed burns are no longer being carried out because they're too difficult to control, so management of jack pines comes through the chainsaw instead. About 350 square miles are now being managed this way, and the species population has recovered to the point where there might be about 5,000 birds in the wild now. and they were officially delisted in 2019. They've even spread into areas where they were previously unknown, across the border in Canada, where they first turned up in 2007, and central Wisconsin, where they first bred in the early aughts. Because of their extreme habitat specificity, there will always be concern about Kirtland's warbler populations. And we haven't even talked about the threats to their overwintering habitat in the Bahamas, but there's no doubt these birds have been pulled out of the proverbial wildfire. So speaking of birds in the Gulf of Mexico, let's talk about pelicans. And pelicans, in particular, the brown pelican, is found on the Atlantic coast from New Jersey to the mouth of the Amazon River and along the Pacific coast from British Columbia to northern Chile, including the Galapagos Islands. They mainly eat fish, but they'll also eat amphibians and crustaceans. So they'll sometimes eat the eggs of nesting birds. And pelicans nest in colonies in secluded areas, often on islands, any vegetated land amongst sand dunes, thickets of shrubs and trees, and they'll even nest in mangrove habitats as well. They were at risk at the turn of the 20th century due to hunting pressure. President and Long Islander Teddy Roosevelt set aside an island in Florida for pelican conservation in 1903. And that was all well and good for a while, but in the mid-20th century, things took a turn for the worse. Populations nosedived again, pun semi-intended, in the 40s and 50s when DDT use took off. DDT is a pesticide that was sprayed on crops when it rained, the DDT ran off onto the ground, eventually making its way into waterways where it was taken up systemically by aquatic plants. Those plants got eaten by little things, which got eaten by bigger things, and the toxins made their way all the way into the fish that were eaten by pelicans. In birds, DDT makes eggshells thin and brittle and easily cracked. And by the 1960s, the pelicans had almost disappeared completely along the Gulf Coast and in Southern California. It had suffered almost a total reproductive failure due to DDT usage in the United States. It became extinct in Louisiana in 1963, and finally they were listed as an endangered species in 1970. And they were only delisted in 2009. There we go. Between 1968 and 1980, the Louisiana Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, or Wildlife and Fisheries, conducted a reintroduction program to reestablish brown pelicans, and their populations in California and Texas were restored due to improved reproduction and natural recolonization. By 1985, the population of pelicans in the eastern U.S., including Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama, and northward, had recovered, and the species was removed from the endangered species list finally, as we said, in 2009. Its population has grown by about 68% per decade for a period of about 40 years in North America, and this trend appears to be continuing. It is still listed as endangered in the Pacific Coast region and in the southern and central United States, although the U.S. Gulf Coast populations in Louisiana and Texas are still endangered. They were recently estimated to be about 12,000 breeding pairs, which is probably good enough to get delisted pretty soon if they, these specific populations anyway. Since that time, the Deepwater Horizon spill adversely affect their populations, and current population figures aren't readily available at this point. Speaking of endangered birds, let's talk about California condors, one of my absolute favorite bird species. At the time of the first human settlements of the Americas, the California condor was widespread across North America. Condor bones from the late Pleistocene period, or epoch, whatever it's, Pleistocene epoch, have been found at the Cutler fossil site in South Florida. But at the end of the last glacial period came the extinction of the megafauna that led to the subsequent reduction in range and population of condors. So once the woolly mammoths and ground sloths and cave bears disappeared, so did the condors. 500 years ago, the condor roamed across the American Southwest. faunal remains of condors have been found in Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Texas. The Lewis and Clark expedition in the 19th century reported seeing them in near the mouth of the Columbia River in Washington state. But they've been on their way down ever since the Ice Age ended. Megafauna went away. Smaller prey can't support as many individuals. I once read somewhere that beached whales along the Pacific coast sustained them, and that's why they still exist in California. I don't know to what extent that's actually true, because whales don't get beached all that often. But again, that's something that I read. Nowadays, the main culprit, in more modern times, the main culprit was lead shot. So hunters used, lead shot to go deer hunting or whatever, and they would kill some deer, and they would either not recover the deer at all, or they would, field dress the deer, maybe take the antlers, but leave the body. And condors would come along and eat the deer, but also eat the lead shot contained within them. So lead poisoning became a major issue for condors as well. And so by the year 1987, there were exactly 22 condors left in the entire world. Now, fortunately, there were people who were willing to help. All of the California condors were taken into captivity in 1987. They were brought to different zoos around the West Coast, in particular San Diego, who led the captive breeding program. And their reintroduction began really just 5 years later. This was in Southern California. They were reintroduced to the Grand Canyon in 1996. And they didn't really occupy the Grand Canyon, not at least in recent times, but they've been reintroduced there. There are now over 500 individuals living in the wild, and there are more living in zoos. They're starting to spread outside of the areas to which they've been reintroduced. They bred in Mexico for the first time in 2007. They bred in Northern California for the first time in 2014. They're even spreading into Sequoia National Park in Northern California as well. And we have one more species for us to take to study today, and that, of course, is the familiar bald eagle. Bald eagles occupy the entire continent, from the Arctic of Canada all the way down to the southern United States, to the Gulf Coast and the West Coast as well. And bald eagles are a North American species, which is why they were named the national bird of the U.S. And the reason that bald eagles became endangered is the same reason as pelicans, because of, number one, hunting, and number two, the use of DDT. Bald eagles are fish eaters, which means that fishermen don't like them very much. And there are some people who, commercial fishermen in particular, who are not very well disposed towards bald eagles and ospreys, and are happy to get rid of them because they think they're competing for fish. Now, consider how many fish are taken by commercial fishermen every year, and then consider how many would be eaten by a bald eagle in a year. It is a tiny fraction of what the fishermen take. And to think that they couldn't spare a few for some birds is a little hard to understand. But even more importantly, bald eagle populations were harmed by the use of DDT for the same reason that pelicans were harmed. DDT got into waterways, so it got into plants and got into the fish that they were eating, and it made their eggs thinner and more brittle and more easily broken, and that their nesting success drastically fell off. Now, fortunately for the bald eagles, they've been protected for a long time. Their populations have recovered quite remarkably, I should say, since the 1960s. They're now reoccupying most parts of their former range. They're on Long Island now. Of course, they're breeding in Centerport, and I believe in the Massapequa Preserve. I think they tend to hang out in Hempstead Lake State Park. I'm not sure they're breeding there, but they definitely hang out. You can see them all over the island. and they're recovering in all the other parts of the country as well. I remember when I was a kid, bald eagles were endangered, and it was extremely rare to see one. One time we were driving somewhere along Route 17 in New York State, and my mother said that she saw a bald eagle sitting in a tree along the banks of the Susquehanna River, and we none of the rest of us saw it. And for decades since then, we've been making fun of her for having said that she saw a bald eagle. I'm sure she did, but that's just to give you an idea of how rare they were at the time. But now they're everywhere. Like I said, they are everywhere. And once we banned the use of DDT, bald eagles started coming back very quickly. And now, like I said, they are recovering very, very well. I remember when they were delisted from the Endangered Species Act, or from the Endangered Species List, I should say. Happened, I think, when I was a teenager, maybe. And this was big, big news because I never knew that anything could be delisted. I didn't know it was possible for an endangered species to recover to the point where they're no longer considered endangered anymore. And the bald eagles have been and continue to be. So that is our talk for this afternoon. Thank you all very, very much for coming. And it's been 40 years since the passage of the Endangered Species Act. And we can see the incredible impact that piece of legislation has had on wildlife in North America. There are many species that wouldn't exist today, even more than we've been able to talk about today, that wouldn't exist without this legislation. And we didn't even talk about plants. We were only doing animals. So thank you guys all very much for coming. I'd be happy to take some questions if anybody has. So I guess you can unmute yourselves if you have a question.
Unmute themselves. That would be great.
Okay. And if you're shy, you can also type a question in the chat box, whichever works for you. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. I appreciate it too. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm traveling to California next week for work, and I am hoping to steal a little bit of time to see some California condors. It's kind of been my life's dream, and I was in California once before, and the weather just didn't cooperate. But this time around, I'm really, really optimistic.
Okay,
I'll
fingers
finally
crossed.
get to see some condors. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So once again, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope I get a chance to talk to you again sometime soon.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.